Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something really special. We're going to explore how one single pioneer woman's story completely redefined our historical memory of the American West. We'll be looking at Willa Cather's 1918 masterpiece, My Ántonia, and the very real woman who inspired it. So let's just jump right in, because honestly, this isn't just a basic literary analysis. It's a profound look at exactly how the American frontier was shaped, remembered, and ultimately romanticized. Picture a pioneer woman working a vast, totally unforgiving landscape. It's an iconic image, right? It perfectly captures the spirit of the American immigrant experience. You know, when we think of 19th century westward expansion, our minds usually go straight to cowboys and outlaws. But the true foundation of the frontier, that was built on the backs of immigrant families, and specifically, the enduring strength of pioneer women. Her story is the absolute starting point for a massive paradigm shift in how we view American history.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, the real pioneer woman. Then, surviving the immigrant experience. After that, redefining 19th century female strength, followed by manifest destiny and nostalgia. And finally, a symbol of the land.
Let's start with Section 1, the real pioneer woman, Annie Pavelka.
Now, you might not know this, but before Ántonia Shimerda became one of the most famous characters in American literature, she was a real person named Annie Pavelka. Willa Cather didn't just invent her out of thin air, she based her almost entirely on cold, hard reality. It's actually incredible how close the fiction is to the facts. Both women were born in Bohemia, which is in today's Czech Republic. Both families immigrated to the harsh plains of Nebraska in 1880. Both endured severe hardships, bore a child out of wedlock after being abandoned by a railroad worker, and ultimately married good-natured Czech men, raising these massive, bustling families. Knowing the factual life of Annie gives just immense historical credibility to Cather's novel. It's fascinating to track how actual history transforms into enduring myth. We go from Annie's birth in 1869 to her immigration to the birth of her daughter in 1892. But the real turning point, that happens in 1916. Willa Cather takes a trip back to the Pavelka farmstead and sees her old friend who is now this incredibly robust matriarch. She had survived and thrived despite staggering odds. Cather was absolutely floored by her resilience. And just 2 years later, My Ántonia is published, immortalizing Annie for generations to come. Moving right along to Section 2, Surviving the Immigrant Experience, Shattering the Myth. We really need to strip away those nostalgic sepia-toned myths of pioneer life for a second, because the reality was grueling. The American dream came at a devastating cost for European settlers. The Shimerda family traded a cultured old-world life in Bohemia for extreme poverty in Nebraska. Imagine spending a freezing Nebraska winter living in a cramped house made literally out of dirt. They could barely communicate because of the language barriers, and the alienation was so profound that Antonia's father, who is the sensitive musician, was completely broken by homesickness. He tragically takes his own life during the coldest part of the winter. Following that, Antonia has to step up, basically sacrificing her youth to backbreaking farm labor just to keep her family alive. And you have to understand, the Nebraska prairie back then wasn't just some passive background scenery. It was a powerful, living character in its own right. It's an environment that is simultaneously breathtakingly beautiful, utterly terrifying, and entirely indifferent to human suffering. The characters in this history only succeed by working in absolute harmony with the land, accepting its terms. Those who try to resist it or who simply can't adapt to its harshness, like Mr. Shimerda, are completely destroyed by it.
All right, Section 3, Redefining 19th Century Female Strength, Defying Conventions.
Ántonia didn't just survive this landscape, she absolutely shattered the gender norms of her era. Think about the mainstream 19th century American expectation for women. It was all about Victorian fragility. Women were supposed to be delicate, domestic, and heavily constrained by strict social hierarchies, which, let's be honest, is completely absurd when you're trying to survive on a wild prairie. So Cather uses Ántonia to celebrate a completely new paradigm, pioneer strength. This is a strength rooted in profound physical endurance, in literally breaking the sod in the fields, and in sheer natural vitality. Ántonia represents a ruggedness that mainstream American culture at the time simply didn't know how to handle.
Her defiance was just uncompromising. She worked the fields right alongside the men so her family wouldn't starve. Later on, she took a job as a hired girl in the town of Black Hawk, which was definitely frowned upon by the town elites. And when she was manipulated and abandoned by a deceitful train conductor, left pregnant and unwed, she didn't just marry for convenience to hide her shame. No way. She proudly returned to the farm, raised her child alone, and ultimately thrived, becoming the radiant matriarch of 11 children. She really is an icon of unapologetic female independence. Which brings us to Section 4, Manifest Destiny and Nostalgia, the macro-historical lens.
To really grasp why Antonia's journey changed history, we need to zoom out a bit to the massive historical shifts happening in the nation. Let's talk about manifest destiny. This was the 19th century doctrine claiming that the expansion of the United States across the continent was not just justified, but totally inevitable. It was the ideological engine driving this vast westward migration, entirely fueling the desire to, quote-unquote, tame the untamed land. But here is the catch, and it's a big one. Who is actually telling the story of this expansion? Enter the unreliable narrator. My Ántonia is framed as a memoir written by Jim Burden. Jim is an orphan who moved to Nebraska as a boy, but eventually left to become a highly successful lawyer in distant New York City. Jim filters all this brutal history through a heavy lens of romanticized nostalgia. He misses the innocence of his childhood, and so he transforms Antonia into a pristine symbol of a vanished past. And it's a deeply human thing to do, right? We often passively romanticize a bygone era rather than confront the gritty reality of our present lives. It really begs the question, how much of our history is actually just memory colored by emotion?
And our final stop, Section 5, a symbol of the land, the fading of an era.
So when Jim finally goes back to visit Antonia 20 years later, he doesn't find a broken woman. He finds this vibrant, weathered mother, and he has this realization, stating, she was a rich mine of life, like the founders of early races. She completely transcends all her grueling hardships. She isn't just a farmer anymore. She becomes the foundational symbol of the very immigrant spirit that physically built the country.
And this leads us to what is honestly one of the most stunning visual metaphors in American literature, a plow silhouetted against an enormous setting sun, which Jim and Antonia watch together. On one hand, it represents a fleeting moment of perfect harmony between human culture, the plow, and raw nature. But as the sun sinks lower, the plow appears to shrink, ultimately showing the overwhelming dominance of the landscape over the people who live on it. That setting sun symbolizes the closing of the American frontier. The wild, untamed prairie of their youth is being permanently transformed into settled farmlands. A whole way of life is disappearing forever. At the end of the day, Antonia's journey changed history because she forced the narrative of the American West to evolve. It was no longer just a simple, triumphant tale of manifest destiny and masculine expansion. It became a deeply complex story of human resilience, of the staggering sacrifices made by immigrants, and of an entirely new kind of female heroism rooted right there in the dirt. She represents the enduring spirit of ordinary people building a life from absolutely nothing.
So I'll leave you with this thought to chew on. How are your own family histories, or even our broader national myths, shaped by the nostalgic memories of storytellers like Jim Burden? When we look back at the past, are we really seeing the brutal, dirt-floored reality, or are we just staring at a beautiful sunset? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.